Welcome to the Workbench and welcome to another episode of Wheels Wings TV with the announcement of Eduard's brand new tool, 148 scale A6M2 Zero. We thought we'd have a look at the closest competition, being the Hasegawa 148 scale A6M2 Zero, dating from the glorious 1990s. Let's have a look. First sprue, we have our fuselage halves, our engine cowling, prop blades, spinners, some little nubbins and bits and pieces. We've got our engine cowling way out here by itself, so obviously some multi-part mold action going on. And in fact, there is a little bit of a mold line down the side of the gun troughs here, so that'll need to be sanded down and whatever panel lines rescribed. Panel lines that are there are nice and sharp. A little bit of a mold line around the lip of the cowling as well to be taken out, but that's not too bad. Fuselage halves, nice sharp panel lines. Some fastener detail where appropriate. Some nice subtle fabric look on the rudder. We have our upper cowling in front of the cockpit where the machine guns protrude. We've got the ignition ring and I guess with push rods molded in for the engine, as well as the forward forward area of the wheel wells with the oil cooler scoop. We have the shorter and longer spinners with the prop hub. No cockpit detail molded in place. Those probably separate pieces. Looking pretty good so far. Next sprue, as I thought, separate cockpit sidewalls with structure and major components molded in place. We've got our arrestor hook, landing gear legs, with surprisingly not much of a seam to take down. That's nice. Cockpit floor, got our main wheels, which don't appear to be flattened or bulged anywhere. We have an alternate front of the radial engine. We have that radial engine itself with some very nice cooling fin detail molded in place. We have our inner wheel well doors, some levers and control column, tail wheel. Gonna assume muzzles for our machine guns or cannons. We have the pilot seat with a representation of the lightning holes molded in. For complete effect, you would want to drill those out and probably thin down the seat from the back a bit. We've got our instrument panel with decent representation of gauges, very lightly molded on, but decal or a bit of dry brushing and that'll look really nice. Side console, rudder pedals. We have our tail planes with our nice fabric effect on the elevators. In fact, the plastic is actually a little bit more matted than the metal areas, adding a little bit more texture. Drop tank in two halves. Ejector pins where they're not going to be that important, although we do have a little bit of extra plastic on there. I'm going to make sure to scrape that down. Engines detailed front and rears. That's nice to see. Some Hasegawa kits from this era, they would have the entire engine molded as one piece, so you're only seeing the detail from the front, which is not a huge deal, but nice to see they went to this effort though. Some ejector pins on the inside of the wheel well doors here, covers, knock those down. And the wheels are keyed to line up in one particular direction, so make sure you don't mix them up. Looking pretty good. And lastly, for the gray parts, we have our upper and lower wings. More nice fabric effect on the massive ailerons. I never noticed how big the ailerons in the Zero were. That's probably part of the reason it had such stellar maneuverability, but that's probably also part of the reason why the controls would lock up at high speed, because that's a lot of surface area to move with just muscle. Very nice sharp control panels, panel lines, what am I saying? Some raised little details as necessary. We've got separate wingtip lights, fastener detail where appropriate, some basic detail in the wheel wells, and nice to see we have the ejection ports for those wing-mounted cannons molded open. That's nice to see. And a little bit of a recess molded for the cannons. On the A6M2, they did not protrude from the wing, they were mounted internally. Yeah, looks pretty good. And lastly, the clear parts. So we have two different rear sections, windshield and the sliding portion, along with our wingtip lights and the gun sight, which is of course molded left and right, so there's a seam down the glass. Parts are relatively clear. There is a bit of distortion on the rearmost section, but there's not much going on back there in the cockpit, so that's not a big deal. That looks, whatever you put in there, you will see. Now there's a bit of scuffing and a bit of scratching on this, because this thing has probably been, the date on this box is 2001, so this thing's been sliding around the box for the better part of 20 years. Framing is almost non-existent, just a couple very faint raised lines either side. So that's going to make masking relatively difficult. Not impossible, just difficult. Fortunately, I believe most of the corners are all square, so you don't have any radiuses to deal with, so you could do the old thin strips, mask the perimeter trick instead of using a big piece of tape. Or the advantage of something like this being on the market so long, there are bound to be pre-cut masks if that is your take. But perfectly acceptable for the time. And our instructions. Now, obviously, these are not the kit's original instructions. This thing's been floating around long enough. I guess they disappeared, so we do have a printout. If you ever get an old used kit and you're missing the instructions, get onto ScaleMates and see if you can find your particular kit, because oftentimes they will have PDFs of the instructions, which is great. History of the Zero in Japanese and in English. And we've got our cockpit going together first, floor, sidewalls, handily naming what all the different pieces are, machine guns, instrument panel, seat adjustment lever, control stick, rudder pedal, Type 98 reflector gun sight. And these, of course, would all be painted in that Japanese interior green color, which is often debated. There's about as many arguments about that as there is about zinc chromate and British gray-green. Fuselage halves come together, trapping the cockpit with the upper cowling and the barrels for the 7.7mm machine guns. We've got our engine going together with the rear exhaust collector, front and rear row, along with the front of the engine with the push rods. We've got okay, why are they showing me this twice? Fill recessed panel lines with the air putting in. I guess alternate positioning of the exhaust pipes by the looks of it. So option 1 has it right at the very bottom panel, whereas option 2 has them the next panel up. So I guess that's going to be dependent on paint scheme, I will assume. Cowling goes on. Now, of course, you could leave the engine and the cowling separate for painting. Headrest tailplanes go in. Upper and lower wing halves go together. Fill recessed lines with sea glue or putty. So there are some redundant panel lines that need to be filled. And a couple of holes that need to be opened in the lower wing. Wing goes onto the fuselage goes onto the wing, whatever your perception. That front piece, separate front piece of the wheel well goes in place. Landing lights go on. Some little widgets on the wings. Left and right landing gear with the wheel and the cover. 320-liter fuel tank. Pitot tube, landing gear, doors, fuel tank, tail wheel, and arrestor hook go into place. Prop blades and hub are assembled. Now the front is silver with a couple of stripes. The rear, probably black or that brown color. Radio mast goes into place. Then the clear canopies. Now they don't show this section being positioned open, so you might be slightly too tight for you to fit if it's molded to size. Prop goes on, and the plane is done. There are some parts called out for not for use. And color callouts in Mr. Hobby, color and aqueous paints. And paint schemes. Option 1, Type 21 Tainan Naval Air Group, aircraft of Petty Officer First Class Saburo Sakai, June-August 1942, one of the top Japanese aces of the Second World War. And a type, okay, so that exhaust difference is for the Type 21 versus the Type 11 A6M2 Zero. 12th Naval Air Group, Petty Officer 2nd Class Saburo Sakai, May of 1941 in China. And overall, that sort of light Japanese gray-green color, if I'm not mistaken. 35, yeah, so they're saying green Mitsubishi. Not white, as they were painted in Tora Tora Tora. It was a very pale gray-green color, not dissimilar from the modern Royal Canadian Navy gray. Decals go in place. Now, Even if this was the original instructions, these wouldn't be printed in color. These would be black and white. Some of the older Hasegawa kits would have a bit of blue here and there, but no issue there. And lastly, the decals. So these are going, it says right here, 2001. So made in Japan. So lots of clear film, especially on these wing walk markings. But these are incredibly thin, so they shouldn't give you too much trouble. Instrument panel gauges are exquisitely done. Hinamaru's look good, although, especially not having the white outline, you have no excuses not to dig out your circle cutter and mask and paint these. Same with any of the stripes. Generally, stripes, you're better off spending an hour masking and painting than spending an hour messing around with decals, and then that one decal becomes 5 decals. Biggest complaint of Hasegawa decals of this time period is, for whatever reason, they could not do pure white. It was always a varying yellowish ivory color. On the gauges, you don't notice so much. When it's big stripes going on the outside of the aircraft, it's very noticeable. But I think for what decals we would be using off of this sheet, they should behave very nicely. So, a little blast from the past with the Hasegawa 1/48 scale A6M2 Zero. These are still super common, can be found new on the shelf or used in various people's collection because there are so many different boxings of them. Still a perfectly good kit. Nice crisp moldings, just enough detail for most people, but a good base if you're one of those people that like to go crazy. Now, I have no doubt the new Eduard kit is going to blow this thing out of the water in terms of details, as Eduard is wont to do with any new kit that they do. But if you're looking for a quick, simple, straightforward little build, the Hasegawa kit is still perfectly serviceable. So if you want to see more content like this, make sure you subscribe and hit that like button. Thank you very much, and we'll catch you next time.